So I'm Travis Marcotte. I'm the Executive Director of the Intervale Center. And it's my pleasure to welcome everybody here for the first ever Farmsland People Stories of the Intervale. We've never done this, and our whole goal was really to figure out how we can have people of the community who have experiences in the Intervale come share a little bit of that magic with everybody. And I think the turnout tonight and all the new faces really underscore we've sort of hit the nail on the head with this one. I'm not going to talk a whole lot. I want to thank Flynn Space for making this available for us tonight. It's an amazing space. The bar will be open along the way. I think I'd encourage people to stay through the stories and then engage in the bar and some mingling afterwards. I'm going to introduce everybody here and then sit down, kind of get out of the way and relax, and then come back up and thank everybody a little bit. So without further ado, I want to go through the list of people that are going to be speaking tonight. So first off, we've got Mandy Fischer, our Development Director at the Intervale Center. Tom Hudspeth, former board member and an amazing leader in our community, worked at UVM for a very long time. So Tom Hudspeth's going to come up. Bill Mayers, who you get to see here on the radio quite often and has been institution in the Intervale around bees for a very long time. Super excited for Bill coming up. And Ron Krupp's going to share a story with us tonight. And Ron told me that the audience would say old woodchuck, so I didn't have to. So welcome, Ron, and thank you very much. Then we're going to move to Eric Seitz, who's one of the co-owners of Pitchfork Farm in the Intervale. Melissa Pasanen is going to tell us a very nice story, a local author that you guys all probably know quite well. And we're going to round it out with Seth Gillim, who used to work at the Intervale Center and is now at the Simba program and is going to take us home with a great story. So the storytellers are going to go one right after another, and they'll introduce each other along the way. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mandy Fisher, who I've worked with for almost 12 years now at the Intervale Center, an instrumental person on our staff. Welcome, Mandy.
I was born in a rural hospital in Milford, Delaware, in the same delivery room where my father and his twin brother were born, at 6 o'clock at night, dinner time. Now, Milford is a poultry processing town. And what I mean by that is last year, 605 million birds were raised and slaughtered within 90 minutes of the house where I grew up. When I say chicken processing, I mean instead of like a regular, like, this is a joke, so I'm messing it up. Instead of a regular traffic report in the morning on the radio, you can call in to alert other drivers to where there's chickens literally crossing the road. That's true. Totally true. So my father was a fertilizer and feed salesman, and my mother was a special education teacher. And I was raised in a ranch house with red vinyl siding on about an acre of land that had a creek and a swamp in the backyard. And my childhood was kind of hard. It wasn't very fun. A lot of like bad things happened that I didn't understand as a kid. And I was also fat, I had terrible teeth, I couldn't read, and I didn't really have any friends. But I did have one friend, Beth, who lived up the hill from me. She also didn't have any other friends. And so Beth would come over after school, and she and I would go play in the creek and in the swamp. And there's basically 3 things we like to do out there. 1, fight. 2, try to get some snakes on sticks and then fight with the snake sticks. And 3, dare each other to smell stinky stuff in the swamp. I also played these same games plus crabs in the salt marsh in the summer with my 2 cousins who would hang out with me. But all that being said, the marsh, the swamp, the creek, these were real refuges for me as a kid. And another place that I really loved to go was the convent. My great aunt Dady, who's still alive, she's 102, was Mother Superior when I was a kid. And I'd go to the convent and I would play in the orphanage where there were no longer children. And I was like a superstar child at the orphanage, at the convent. And I just really loved sitting among the nuns while they sang. And I loved how devoted they were. And I loved how they treated me like they're equal. And they asked me big, important questions. This was a place of big questions every day. And I fell in love with those questions. And eventually went on to study theology, starting in high school, then in college, and then ended up at Harvard Divinity School, where I was training to become a theologian. And in particular, what was interesting to me was the problem of evil, which in theology is known as Theodicy. And basically the problem of evil is, if God is all good, all-knowing, and everywhere, how does evil exist in the world? Another way to think about it is, how do you justify the existence of God given evil? And this is a question that I became very, very curious about. My studies led me to the University of Chicago, and while I was there, I started to become kind of disillusioned. I was wondering about what this education I was getting was going to do for the world. And I started to get more and more interested in kind of vernacular American life and sort of getting back into an interest in landscape and agriculture that I'd had as a child. And one day I remember very clearly my sourdough was out on the counter. I was reading a book and I came upon, in this book, I don't know what book, 2 lines about this place, the Intervale. And this place, the Intervale, that I knew nothing about, started to haunt me. I started to think about this place, and eventually I went to my dissertation committee and I said, hey, you guys, I think I want to go to Vermont and check this place out. And they were like, do it. You can go for a year. We'll keep your fellowship. Come back. So over Thanksgiving, I packed up my stuff and we moved to Vermont, December 1st. That's a joke. And, and then a few days later, I walked down the hill to the Intervale, and I walked in the doors, and there was no heat, and there was plastic and stuff boarded up, and I didn't question why I had done this. I met Aziza Malik, who's here, who was then the coordinator of Healthy City, and she put me right to work raising money, and then spring came and I was in the greenhouse, and then eventually I was out clearing, hay from the strawberries that had overwintered, and with my friend, Aziza. And some people would maybe say there was some divine intervention that led me to the Intervale, which is interesting because I've always considered it the first real decision I've ever made in my life to come here. But that's also very American of me, because Americans always answer everything, including the problem of evil, with free will, right? So maybe it was free will. Maybe it was divine intervention very elegantly disguised as free will. You guys are really getting to know me right now. It's nice. So eventually, I got an actual job at the Intervale. It was 15 hours a week, $11 an hour, and I was the grants coordinator, the administrative assistant, and the assistant to the director of agricultural services. So basically, I just did whatever anyone told me to do. I had no desk and no computer. I had a file, like a little file folder that I just carried around with me, and I sat at anyone else's desk when they weren't there. There's a staff laughing really hard. And eventually I did get a computer, and then I got a desk in Travis's office, which he was not happy about at all. But from that office, we weathered the transition of compost. We weathered the departure of over half of our colleagues, and we really started to build with a handful of really brilliant people, some of whom are here. The Intervale Food Hub, which is now a thriving social enterprise for our community, and our agricultural services programs that now serve 100 farmers all over the state of Vermont every year. And I just kept doing whatever was asked of me. That's kind of been my philosophy the whole time. So obviously there are some similarities between Milford and what I do now, but there's also some really big differences. In Milford, Milford is a town that's run by Purdue. And no offense to Purdue or any other multinational corporation. Looking at you guys. But they don't care about people. They don't. They don't care about farmers, workers, eaters. They don't care about animals. They don't care about the earth. And the reality is if they did, we would live in a much, much different world than the one we live in. But at the Intervale, we care about all beings. And instead of extracting wealth from our rural communities, what we're really trying to do is put wealth in. Put wealth in terms of soil, in terms of community, in terms of business, in terms of ecological health. And that's what inspires me every day at my job, and inspires me, all of you come here tonight to celebrate that with us. It's amazing. So obviously, I'm not yet a professional theologian, but I still like to ask big questions. And those include, like, who am I? Why am I here? I'm still also really interested in this problem of evil. There's so much evil in the world. But I think my approach now to this question is, what good can I do now? And one thing I do not question is whether or not I am in the right place to do good, because I know that I am. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Tom Hudspeth, and ever since I came to Burlington in 1972, the Intervale has played a very important role in my life and subsequently my family's. My wife, our daughters as they grew up, and even now our 4-year-old grandson and 6-month-old granddaughter when they come visit us from Putney. I like to take long walks in the Intervale, almost always with the dogs, bike some on the road, and in the winter cross-country ski, except when I have both knees replaced. I love to commune with nature. So I've seen lots of beavers, a few mink, lots of foxes, and even some coyotes crossing over the frozen Winooski River, a whole pack of coyotes one time. While I've never seen bear, I have found bear scat on a few occasions, nor have I ever seen moose, but I did see the moose tracks, the big hoof prints for the moose that wandered around in the Intervale a few years ago that I'm sure quite a few of you did encounter. And of course, lots of birds, including bald eagles along the river and in the former Intervale compost site. And great rafts of mergansers, common and hooded mergansers, around the bend of the river in the wintertime lots of times. I also like to botanize, especially in that rich silver maple, ostrich fern, nettle forest, riverine floodplain forest that's often on a hot summer day easily 20 degrees cooler in the shade than the nearby adjacent farm field. It's been sad for me to notice the changes in the lower herbaceous layer of that floodplain forest over time. Back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, I would see very colorful spring wildflowers at this time of year. And keep in mind, we're very late spring this year. We should have all these things I'm going to mention. Bloodroot and hepatica and trout lily and lots of different kind of violets and even some trillium. But over the past couple of decades, they've all been smothered by the invasive plant called agapodium, bishop's weed or gout weed, and to a lesser degree by another invasive, the Japanese knotweed. Our family has gone on to the Intervale lots as our daughters grew up, picking blueberries at Adams Berries when it was there, picking pumpkins at Pat Mitchell's Pumpkin Patch when it was there, and strawberries at Full Moon Farm when it was there, all along getting to know many of the farmers, quite a few of whom are former environmental studies or natural resource students, and many of whom we would also see regularly at the Burlington Farmers Market on Saturdays. In the early 90s, one summer we joined the CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, associated with ICF, Intervale Community Farm. I think it was the second year they had the CSA. And when we bought our share in the fall, we had these visions of going down every week and picking up our share and getting tomatoes and lettuce and squash and beans and beets and onions and so forth. And that summer was very cold and very wet. And ICF did not have the hoop houses at that point. So when the summer came along, we were somewhat disappointed when we go down and those vegetables I mentioned, there would be relatively skimpy little portions of those, but there would be volumes and volumes of bok choy and cilantro. So needless to say, we had to become somewhat creative that summer in coming up with culinary uses of these bushels of bok choy and cilantro. I've also helped glean for the food shelf, usually zucchini squash. And sometimes, I've never seen zucchini squash that are that big before, but they get that big in the Intervale. And I've also helped out together with some of the Intervale Conservation Nursery staff and other volunteers in collecting cuttings of red twig dogwoods and seeds and nuts and berries. And as Travis mentioned, I served on the board of directors of Intervale Center from 2005 to 2010. So 3 years ago, I retired from teaching and doing research in environmental studies and natural resources at the University of Vermont after 43 years. My teaching approach was to provide active, engaged, authentic, hands-on experiential learning opportunities for the students, blending theory with practice, and often having service learning opportunities where the students could engage with community partners in real-world problem solving that hopefully benefited the community partners. More often than not did benefit the partners, I should add. And often those partnerships had some relationship with some of the research that I was doing at the time and the writing that I was doing at the time, including Intervale Foundation and subsequently Intervale Center. One of the courses was environmental interpretation, which has to do with communicating about natural history and cultural heritage and environmental issues to visitors to national parks and nature centers, museums, botanical gardens, zoos, forests, or farms like the Intervale. And for that class, the students would develop interpretive master plans and self-guided trails and exhibits for such partners as the Green Mountain Audubon Nature Center in Huntington, the Kingsland Bay State Park, Green Mountain National Forest, and many others. But for the last couple of decades, the focus of the course became pretty much interpreting food and beverage in Vermont. And so the partners for which the students developed their interpretive media tended to be like Champlain Chocolates on Pine Street and Cold Hollow Cider Mill in Waterbury Center, and of course, the Intervale Farms, the farms in the Intervale Center. The 25 seniors in the environmental interpretation class gained valuable experience leading almost 300 first-year Environmental Studies 1, Introduction to Environmental Studies students on field trips, on guided field trips of the farms in the Intervale during the week in the fall semester when the students were studying sustainable agriculture and agroecology in their readings and lectures. In the early 90s, our family joined CSA, Community Supported Agriculture, one summer. And I think it was the second summer that IC Intervale Community Farm had sponsored it. And when we signed up for our share in the fall, we had these visions of going down every week. And I already went there. Sorry. Okay, so I've got there. Okay, so the interpretation class, back to the interpretation class. Besides that class, there was a creating environmentally sustainable communities class. And over a quarter of a century for that class, I developed over 300 sustainability stories about individuals and groups in the greater Burlington area who serve as role models or exemplars for others to follow in transitioning to more sustainable, environmentally sustainable lifestyles. People who inspire, encourage, empower others. These kind of creative visionaries who have a vision of a sustainable future, an alternative to the status quo, to business as usual, which in far too many cases is not sustainable at all, and then work to achieve that vision, to put it into reality. Since sustainability, development that meets the needs of current generations without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs, has become a concept or a principle some 30 years ago in the publication of Our Common Future, the Brundtland Commission report. There have been people who challenge it and are critical of sustainability, claiming that it's too vague, it's too abstract, it's just a passing fad, or it's something that happens in the global south, but certainly not in places like here. So my response to that has been all along to try to operationalize sustainability, to try to make it come alive, to try to make it more concrete, to humanize it and put a face on it through these stories that hopefully inspire and that are local and place-based and yet have global implications. And ideally also serve as an antidote to the doom and gloom stories that we tend to be hammered with far too often. So of these 300 stories that were developed for that class, the ones that readers and listeners have found to be by far the most engaging, most compelling, the ones that they have most follow-up questions about and want to know so much more about, have to do with the farmer program in the Intervale Center and the individual farmers in the Intervale. Incubator farmers, enterprise farmers, mentor farmers. And as most of you probably know, a lot of the incubator farmers go on to become enterprise farmers and mentor farmers. And of course, some of them successfully transition away from the Intervale when they purchase or lease their own farms, often on Vermont land trust conserved properties. So it's been my delight to share stories of the Intervale farmers with students in my classes over the decades, as well as with visitors to the Intervale on field trips that I lead, such as in the summers, for UVM has a campus sustainability leadership program that brings educators from across the country here, and over the decades to hundreds of participants at conferences that UVM has sponsored, conferences in environmental education, sustainable communities, environmental studies, natural resources, and ecological economics. So in summary, over the 46 years that I've had the chance to interact with this amazing and special place called the Intervale, there's been a lot of continuity. But there's also been change, much of it for the better, especially the increase in the reputation of Intervale Center for its farm program and for especially the incubator farmer program. It's providing a replicable model of local, organic, place-based agriculture that provides a sustainable alternative to the conventional, faceless, industrialized agriculture that mines our topsoil, that pollutes with herbicides and pesticides, and that uses fossil fuels to transport food on an average of 1,500 miles from where it's grown or produced to where it's consumed. So sustainability and community building are right here before us, right before our very eyes, right now, and the folks in the Intervale Center are leading the charge. Thank you.
Can you all hear me? Okay. Thank you all for coming. This is an incredible turnout. Thank you all for supporting the Intervale. I was raised in Texas in a very small town. In fact, it was so small that the welcome and goodbye signs were on the same post. I had a horse, and my brothers and I had chickens. And that was our outdoor activities until about 20 years later, when my wife and I moved to St. Johnsbury. And I was working for a newspaper across the river in New Hampshire, and we were living in this old rundown farmhouse, and so it was a time when people were doing back to the land things. And so we dipped our toes into a sheep and a large garden, and what else? Chickens, bees, and I made a lot of homebrew, not very well. But the two things that stuck, for me anyway, were the beer, which is not tonight's subject, and also the bees. And one of the reasons that I did that was because in St. Johnsbury, or in Lower Waterford, which was the adjoining town, there was a retired geologist, a man named Arnold Waters, who had spent his professional life searching for diamonds all around the world. He worked for De Beers, and he was sort of Bantam Rooster kind of guy. He weighed about 125 pounds, soaking wet, with a brick in each hand. But he was tough as nails. And what's more, he was an excellent beekeeper. And even more than that, he was a great teacher. And he became the Pied Piper of beekeeping in the Northeast Kingdom. And he's the one who introduced me to bees. He showed me what to buy. He comforted me when my bees were destroyed by a bear. And I swore at the time that if ever I grew to his age, I would be a teacher as he was. Well, 5 or 6 years later, my wife and I moved to Burlington. And I wanted to take my hives with me. And I searched around, and I had a succession of homes for those bees, first in Williston, and then in Shelburne, and then in South Burlington, and finally, a couple of hives behind my house on South Willard Street, and also up at UVM off of Spear Street. Well, in the 80s, I think it was Penrose Jackson who was the executive director of the foundation. She invited me to go on the board, and I was on the board. Well, I didn't contribute very much, but I do remember a board meeting where we were talking about numbers, and I was sort of daydreaming, and I was looking for another place to put bees. And I thought, well, how about the Intervale? So I asked Penrose, and she said it was okay, and other board members seemed to be okay. So I brought 3 or 4 hives, and we put them on the berm down there below the settling pond. And that was really nice. And so I had 3 places where I had bees. But at the same time, and this was talking about, I don't know, not free will or fate, the Vermont Beekeepers Association, of which I was the secretary, decided that they wanted to move their, they had a lot, a set of hives down in Addison, and they wanted it closer to the population base of northwestern Vermont. And so I said, well, why don't you bring them up to the Intervale, and or if you don't, we'll use my hives, and we'll use those for our 7 workshops that we spread out through the course of the year. Well, they did that. And so then we had this great set of hives to teach with. And at about the same time, I was teaching history at Seaview High School. They started a program to teach, well, it was called Access, and the motto was teach your passion. And I said, well, I could teach beekeeping. So we started an evening class. First year we had 6 people, and then the next year we had 12, and then the next year we did it twice, and the next year after that we did 3 times. And so over the last 15 years, we probably taught 800, 900 people beekeeping. So the great thing is this marriage, this linking of the 2 kinds of teaching, where we can do the classroom teaching at CVU, and then people can come and get some hands-on experience at the Intervale. And teaching beekeeping is really great. I mean, it's the first thing I always say in the class is, teaching beekeeping is like dealing legal drugs, because you really get a chance to challenge to turn people on to this incredible hobby that helps to sustain our world. The bees, frankly, are not going to survive without humans now. They're under a lot of stress. The beekeeping is both an art and a science. It's farming for intellectuals, says Sue Hubble, a woman who wrote a great book about bees. And you get a chance to work with nature and it's art and science. So it's really it's been a wonderful experience to both teach in the class and to teach out in the field. And so I've been grateful to the Intervale Foundation or the Intervale for this space. And even now I have 2 partners, Dan Goosen, who's here, and Ron Hernandez. We are BTV Honey, and we sell our honey to Food Hub. So if you're buying stuff from the Food Hub, we hope you're eating our honey. And I am happy to say that I've gotten to that I hope Arnold Waters, at his just reward, approves of my work in his memory. And I like to remember what Kirk Webster, who's a beekeeper in Bridport, says, that the bees are the color, everything else is black and white. Thanks very much.
I've been a member of the Tommy Thompson Community Garden for about 20 years, give or take. I'm not sure how many, but it's been a long time. Tommy Thompson is an amazing place. We have about 3 acres of community garden. It's by far the largest community garden in the state. It's surrounded by fields, forests, and the Winooski River. I remember early on when I was gardening down there, if I stayed too long, Rena Calkins' cows would get ahead of me. They'd be meandering down the road, and I'd get behind them. And in a way, it was good because I slowed down, and after all, we all have to slow down. Yeah. You don't see the cows there anymore. But the barn, they were going down to where the Intervale Center is located. There was a barn nearby. So that's where they ended up, and eventually I went home. It was like meditation practice. Over the years, we've had many immigrants come and garden down at Tommy Thompson. It was generally because of the wars that were taking place all over the world. Aika Sarkisova from Eastern Europe came with her heirloom tomato seeds, which she gave to me, and I grew tomatoes, and then I gave tomato seeds to other folks who grew tomatoes. My family from Vietnam grew greens, and they grew lots of greens. And one time, they gave me some chrysanthemum greens. So I took them home and I put them in a salad, and boy, were they nasty tasting. So I went back the next day, And I spoke to my family, and they started chuckling. They said, Ron, you got to steam them. And then you got to add herbs. So they said, come back the next day, and they steamed some up for me, and they put garlic and herbs, and they were delicious. Phoebe and Raimundo were from Managua, Nicaragua, which I had visited a number of times. And they brought with them peppers. And of course, they gave me the seeds, and I grew them. And then I gave other folks seeds, and they grew them. Now, Phoebe and Raimundo, one night in the middle of winter, they invited me over to their house in the old North End. They said they were going to have a barbecue. And I was thinking to myself, isn't it a little cold to be having a barbecue? Well, I went into their house, and next to the window with a fan, they had a barbecue. And it was a very interesting, I chuckled to myself, and I said, this is like being in Nicaragua, out in the countryside, where many people have poor homes and they don't have the kitchens. They use wood to cook on, and so there would be smoke in the kitchen. Phoebe and Raimundo worked at Costco, and they ran the bakery with their other friends. And I had never been to Costco, and they kept inviting me. And I said, well, okay. But they said, we'll meet you at the front door. So when I walked in, I was undergoing culture shock. What an irony. Here they were from Nicaragua. They came here. They worked in the bakery. And when I met them at the front door, they had to hold my hand. Eventually, Phoebe and Raimundo moved to Brownsville, Texas, where they ran the greenhouse for Costco. And now and then they come back and we visit with each other with no barbecues. There are many other folks I could talk about. Everything wasn't always beautiful down in the Intervale. At times, well, it was what I called the dark side. I remember meeting a guy who was wearing a backpack and he had some binoculars. And he was, looking up at the birds. And I know a little bit about birds, not a lot. And so I would point to a bird and I would name it. And then I would point to another bird and I said, what kind of bird is that? And I kept pointing to birds and he didn't know the names of those birds. So I asked him to empty his backpack, and it was full of vegetables. Well, another time, there were two older ladies, sort of grandmothers, that were driving an old Volvo station wagon. And I noticed they kept driving into the gardens a lot. And I went over to speak to them, and I asked them if they were members of the community garden. And they said they weren't. And they said, well, isn't this a community garden? And I said, yeah, but you got to pay and you got to do the work. So that was the last time I saw the grandmothers. Sonny Martin was a homeless fellow, and he was a very nice gentleman. He was living at a residence for homeless people who had disabilities, and he loved being down in the Intervale. And Burlington Parks and Rec gave him a weed whacker, and eventually he got the name Sonny the Weed Whacker, because when someone didn't take care of their gardens, Sonny would whack them down. He also had a lawnmower. And he did this amazing, he kept Tommy Thompson looking park-like. He'd mow behind the sheds. He'd mow along the fence line. And sometimes he actually mowed people's gardens down. Well, he died a number of years ago, and he's sorely missed. It's interesting because he loved being down there so much that in late fall, after the gardens had been put to bed, you'd see Sonny with his car down there just hanging out because he loved being down there so much. So we really miss Sonny. I'm trying to remember the rest of what I'm supposed to say. I remember. I was a coordinator there for about 15 years. And every year we had, not every year, almost every year we had a potluck supper. And one year in particular, there were a large number of Bosnian families down there. And we had the potluck, and the food that the Bosnian families bought, it was so good. The hippie families brought carrot sticks and celery stalks. So, but anyway, what was amazing about that night is I had an epiphany. I said, let's stand in a circle, let's hold hands, and let's share what our country of origin, where your grandparents came from. And of course, there were no Native Americans among the group. So everyone came from different parts to the world. And it was amazing because you had this feeling that in a way we're all immigrants. And today is a very special day because Martin Luther King used to talk about this country as a nation of immigrants. And of course, you all know that it's been 50 years of his passing. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Hello, can you hear me? All right, great. Wow, that's a lot of you. Hi, I'm Eric. I am one of the owners of Pitchfork Farm. I've been down there since 2006. I started when I was 22. I was out sort of on a 1 acre, like modest parcel on the outskirts of the Intervale. And, you know, I don't really have like one big story, one long story to tell you. I want to share with you a story of my time down there, you know, the last 13 years, and sort of some of the lessons I've learned over the years. You know, not like the technical farmy stuff like Pro-Tech and Remay or indeterminate versus determinate tomatoes, silver mulch and black plastic. That stuff's boring. I want to talk about Intervale stuff, I think, things that you guys would be interested in, stuff everyone should know. You know, if you don't eat anything all day and all you eat is the free popcorn at Ace Hardware, that's okay. Stuff like that, you know, like the stop sign on the way down the Intervale, that's mostly a suggestion, I think. It's pronounced Charlie Boys, all right? You know, the Intervale, it's, among other things, it's a collection of farms. It's many things, but it's a collection of farms, and it's from the farmers I've learned a lot. You know, Dylan at Diggers, he showed me that if you want fall carrots, you got to start them in mid-July. If you go into August, they're not going to develop. Half Pint Farm, Mara and Spencer, they showed me that the more spectacularly beautiful your farm stand is, the better your sales will be at the farmer's market. Thomas Case from Arethusa, he showed me that I'll never, ever grow a beard as glorious as he can. My dog, he showed me that if he kills and eats a groundhog, I don't have to feed him for 4 days. The goddamn deer taught me about electric fencing. The Intervale is a floodplain, we know that, and I learned quickly. I think that first year in May before Memorial Day, we had a flood. I think the river hit 16 feet. I don't think. I looked it up. It hit 16 feet. And I borrowed a canoe from Tom, actually. And I was paddling around, gathering up, ironically, boxes of irrigation equipment that were floating away. And paddling through fields and trees where, just the day before had been peas and chard and lettuce. It was a pain in the ass. But, after the flood comes the mosquitoes. And, but you pick your head up and you pivot. And I learned to make sales, and I started with restaurants, and I love restaurants. And as my business has grown over the years, so the restaurants I've worked with, Flatbread, Skinny Pancake, the Farmhouse Group, these institutions, and I've worked with restaurants that have gone. Lamonte and Ice House and Smoke Jacks. I've seen the inside of every kitchen in this town, I can tell you, and I've made lifelong friends with chefs and buyers. And some of the lessons I've learned: the smaller, as a general rule, the smaller the vegetable, the better price you get. If you can, you always say yes to a chef in a bind. If they need salad greens at 5 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, you can do it, you do it. It never, ever, ever gets old seeing your name on the chalkboard and the menus of the restaurants and grocery stores you work with. And I'll never forget the first time that happened to me. I was a skinny, muddy kid. I wandered down into the basement at Smoke Jacks. It was the first time I met all of our good friends, Frank Pace. He was the chef there at the time, and I wandered down to make a sales pitch. I was bringing what we call a toy box. It's a box of mixed vegetables, stuff that's ready at the time, and I think I brought him like purple peppers and little Asian eggplants and tiny artichokes. What else? Zephyr summer squash, and he freaked out. It was amazing. He kicked me out of the kitchen, and which was actually okay. He sent me back to the farm and told me to bring him back a couple cases of everything, and it was amazing. He ran a special that night with all that stuff, and I'll never forget it. It was just an incredible act of encouragement, and we've been partners in food ever since. What else have I learned? It's better to have the crop and not the sale than to have the sale without the crop. Early on, I forget which season it was. It was very early, though. We grew 1,200 habanero plants, an insane amount of hot peppers. And that September, as they all ripened and obviously the deer weren't eating them, I scrambled. I had to find a home for them, and I called around and I found a hot sauce company in South Burlington. They had a co-pack facility, and I got on the horn, and the guy answered the phone. I said, "Hi, I'm Eric from Pitchfork Farm. I grew all these hot peppers. Do you have any need for?" I grew like a ton of them. And the guy's like, "Let me think. A ton, huh? Yeah, we could take 2,000 pounds." I was like, "Okay, wait. Back it up. Okay." I think I sold him 400 or 500 pounds. But the next year we sold him, I think, a ton of hot peppers. And then 2011, I learned that when it rains, it pours. That was a hard year, I think. It was a snowy winter, a lot of snow in the mountains, and then a cold, wet spring punctuated by a lot of rain. And you guys may all remember, but the lake couldn't take anymore. And the water sat pooled in our fields for a long time. I don't think we were actually able to do anything until mid-June. And then in July, my dog of a long time, and actually the farm's namesake, he died suddenly, and we buried him under a tree right next to the field, and where he's eternally scaring away deer and feral cats. And then late August was Irene. The river hit 23 feet. Jumped the banks, came roaring into our fields, and if you said, "Hey Eric, here's a calendar, point at a date. What's the worst date for a catastrophic flood?" I think August 28th would be it. We got summer crops in full bloom, and then fall crops in their early stages of development, all just washed away or rendered unsellable. think that was a low point for all of us, but we persevered, clearly. And in that, I learned that pigs are not my spirit animal. They are smelly assholes, jerks, strong-head jerks. They will scatter like kids from a high school party, but the cops have just arrived at. They just take off. I learned that nettle stings in your armpit will last for weeks. That a car battery, I think, fetches a thief $5. And that 20 questions with your coworkers never, ever, ever gets old. I learned that farms come and go. People and farms, they come and go. Open Heart Farm, Stroika Farm, Samara Farm, Bessie Field Eggs, Fat Mitchell's Pumpkin Patch, Full Moon Farm, Adams Berries, Needy Farm, Intervale Bean and Grain. It's unbelievable. All these people that I've known that have come and gone, and all these fine people I've had the immense pleasure to know, to work with, to learn from. I've learned. What else have I learned? Molly, what's after? Oh yeah. Thank you. I've learned. Thank you, my wife. I've learned that in this life, it's really, really important to have people on your side, people guiding you, people like Mandy, like Travis, like Bobby, like Sona, guiding you and pushing you, rooting for you. I've learned that an appendectomy in July is a setback. I've learned that there's big fish in the Winooski, and fishing for them at the end of the day is a great way to end a rough week. And I've learned that geniuses walk amongst us, and having one as a business partner is helpful. Speaking of geniuses, I've learned that nothing burns like a wax box except a large pile of them. And on a related note, that springtime grass fires are possible, and that the Burlington Fire Department can carry their own water in fire trucks. So that's good to know. I've learned that the best place in the world, I think, to watch the sunset is the picnic table next to my field with a cold beer and your coworkers on a Friday, laughing about the week. Sorry, I got a little dry mouth here. And I've learned that, I've learned what the Intervale means to the city. That the sum of the Intervale is greater than its parts. It's not just the farms or the tree nursery. It's not the river or the paths, the cross-country skiing, the food hub, or CSA pickup or any of that. I mean, it is those, but it's more. And you see it in the people, in the poet farmers from the Iowa Writers Workshop, or the DJs with the insane Prince vinyl collection who moonlight as the food hub director, or the the entrepreneurial immigrants and the conservationist mechanics and the foodies with the dog to walk. I'm 35 now, and the last 13 years, I've learned that if Church Street is sort of the beating heart, I guess, of Burlington, then the Intervale's its soul, right? It's like the ideals and the values of its people sort of wrought into form, a form you can see and hear and touch and taste. And tomorrow at 7:30, I'll be back at the farm, and I can't wait to see what it has to teach me. So thanks.
Hello. I'm Melissa. My story starts on a late August weekend, beautiful day. We were going to take a hike as a family. So I went over to the computer to look up some trails, maybe find something we hadn't done before. And I saw that things were not looking good for the weekend weather-wise. Saturday was going to be great, but there was a big hurricane. You can guess it was 2011. And among the many things buzzing on social media, the emails coming into my inbox, there was a note from the Intervale Community Farm. We, as a family, had belonged to the farm at that point for over a decade. Now we're approaching 2 decades. But Andy, you were only 13 when I first met you there. And there was a request, a very polite request from ICF saying, if any members have a few extra hours today, Saturday, and could come help us, we are embarking upon Operation Onion Rescue. And then I also saw through other social media, other farms, folks that I knew asking for help. And I thought, yep, there's no way we're going on a hike. We're going to go down and help. Question. Have you ever tried to get teenagers out of bed before 9 a.m. on a weekend morning? You know what makes it harder? Hey kids, we're going to go pick onions. But we did manage to extricate our 2 sons, teenagers at the time, young teenager and middle teenager. And we headed down to the Intervale, where there were a group of, at the time, we arrived probably a dozen or so members, along with farmers, friends, family, helping to pick onions. And it was a beautiful day. Felt sort of surreal, like, really? It's gonna hurricane tomorrow? Okay. And there was farm-grown, sweet, cold, fresh watermelon and cantaloupe, and the kids were like, you know, this is okay. It's not so bad. As our older son said, at least it wasn't beets. I hate beets. So we picked for a while, and I pushed it when I said, maybe we should go help with the tomatoes, where you had to kneel in the dirt and like something. And they were like, no, we're not doing that. So we did some more onions, and I think put in several hours, and all the onions were laid on a table in the hoop house, and we felt pretty good about helping. You know, we did something. And we came home, and we sort of watched the weather, and the next day it started pouring, more pouring. But the wind wasn't as bad as it had been or expected to be, so we thought, well, maybe they're going to dodge a bullet. Towards the evening, Sunday, the rain tapered down, and I was checking my email, obsessively, of course, as I always do, and I saw more posts and emails on social media, et cetera, from farms saying, okay, we're okay for right now, we're kind of holding our breath, but knowing what we know, it's likely the river will break the banks, and so could anyone come help? And as we all know, next Monday morning, the river came up with ferocious force from places apparently it had never come up from before, in directions it had never come up. And I remember a photo that Kathy, I think, posted on the Intervale Community Farm Facebook wall of like a tractor with like people hanging off of it, and the tractor is like fleeing ahead of the impending, you know, doom of waters rising, like a biblical flood, which I think it probably felt like when you guys were down there. And of course, we know that it wasn't just the farms that suffered immensely from that flood. There were whole communities, people's homes obviously gone. And in the weeks and days and months following, everyone was sort of trying to deal with the terrible destruction. And the farms, again, were posting and sharing how sad they were about the abruptly interrupted season, which, as Eric mentioned, had started awful that year too, with incredible spring flooding. But at the same time, they all were so thankful for the help and the support of the community, the teenagers who had gotten up out of bed to come help save a few onions. And as a parent, when you're raising kids, what you're trying to do is make them into healthy adults, good community members, responsible citizens. You expose them to a lot of things. You make them do things that they maybe don't want to do because you hope that someday in the future they'll go, oh yeah, that's why my mom or my dad made me do that. And I have to say, I think I'm kind of proud and a little surprised that both of our boys, now 23 and 20, have chosen to sign up for CSA shares on their college campus and deal with, like, what do I do, as our 20-year-old texted me a few weeks ago. What do I do with this hairy, scary, knobby thing, and what the heck is it? Anyone want to guess? Celery. And our kid who hated beets figured out how to cook them and make them taste like something he'd want to eat. And I remember when they were little and they loved to go and pick strawberries and raspberries and cherry tomatoes. And then I remember when they were like in middle school and they couldn't quite stay at home alone, and I'd bring them and they were like, I don't want to go to pick up. And they'd sit in the car and read whatever they were reading, because that was before iPhones. Oh my gosh, I'm feeling old. But you just never know what's going to take. And it's good to see that they appreciate local farm fresh food and that they're willing to cook it. I think it helps that the parents are willing to pay the bill for the CSA with no questions, but we'll take what we can get. And the thing that I really hope is that they also realize that beautiful late August day that we dragged them out of bed down to pick onions, that we were doing more that day than just saving some onions from a flood.
Can people hear me? Okay, good. So, the Intervale Center turns 30 this year, right? And that's not an insignificant birthday. In fact, in some cultures, it's fraught with meaning. For instance, in my culture, right, which I would describe as white, socially anxious, and kind of like irrationally overconfident in my intelligence, it kind of presents you with a stark set of options, right? On the one hand, you can decide that you're not a kid anymore, and you can embrace the challenge and opportunities of adulthood, time to grow up, right? But then there's this other choice that some of us make, which is to take a good look in the mirror and take a deep breath and do something incredibly kind of short-sighted and stupid, right? In my case, I did the latter, because when I turned 30, what I really decided was that I wanted to become an actor. Now, never mind that I lived here in teeny tiny Burlington, Vermont, right? Or that I didn't really have a plan for how this was going to happen, or that I had friends who by that point in their lives have already been like, this is way too hard, and given up their dreams of a life on the stage. This was the life for me. And I suppose, like the 70-some-odd% of Americans who consider themselves above average, that I had somehow fallen prey to this seductive logic that what was going to make me happy was by living a life that was distinguished, that was unique somehow, right? That I wasn't a normal, average person, right? That joy was somehow synonymous with exceptionalism. And so I packed it up, moved all the way to California, Blue Lake, California, where I enrolled at the Del Arte International School of Physical Theater, right? Where I would spend the next year of my life rolling around on the floor, quite literally clowning around, and as my classmate's father put it at graduation, borrowing good American money to learn how to stand on one leg. The unofficial motto of Del Arte is effort, risk, momentum, joy. And I figured out pretty quickly that I was actually pretty good at the effort, risk, and momentum part, and I was really, really lousy at the joy part. That I just couldn't find any happiness in this path that I had chosen for myself. But like any diligent student, I decided I was gonna grit my teeth, and I was gonna power through, and I was gonna be happy. I was gonna be happy being an actor, right? And the more I efforted, the harder it got and the further away it got. And I just couldn't find any happiness at all in the work. And if the job of an actor is to be a student of the emotions, I was a dismal failure. And so after a year, I decided I was going to hang it up, right? So now here I am, I'm 31, I'm more or less an MFA dropout, no plan, no real direction, no sense of what I'm doing with my life, but I had a couple of key things that were going for me. First of all, I had my wife, who, against all odds, had followed me out to California. We had about $800 between the two of us, and we had this crappy 1997 Saturn that my parents had given to us, right? You had one of those too, huh? Yeah. So anyways, so what do, right? Well, in that moment, you kind of do what anybody has done since the Europeans conquered the continent, right? You just strike out for the territory. So you get in whatever vehicle you have, and you wander around, and you hope that happiness or enlightenment or something kind of resembling home will find you along the way, right? So we launched on the great unplanned North American road trip. And we had been on the road about 2 weeks, and we were driving through Central Oregon. And I don't know if anyone's ever been out that way, but they really like their chainsaws out there. And coming from Vermont, I grew up in Vermont, where here logging is really as much of an art as a science, right? But out there, there's just mile after mile after mile of these massive clear cuts. And I had never seen anything like it before. It blew me away. Like, here was miles of this ancient primeval forest being turned into toilet paper. And people thought that was a good idea, right? And we're driving along, and I'm sitting in the passenger seat, and in a rare moment of self-awareness, I realized that that I was having more of an intense emotional reaction to seeing those trees cut down than I had had in an entire year of acting training. And so I turned to my wife and I said, Kayla, I don't know what this means, but I want to do something to fix this. And she said the most wonderful thing a partner can ever say to you, which is, I support you in that. And so many twisted turns of the road, and about a year later, we found our way back to Vermont, as these things happen. And still, now I'm 32, no plan, right, no real direction, but I have this vision, right? I'm this transformational change agent who's going to protect and restore the planet. And so I got a job at a deli, right? Because, right, and nothing says transformational change agent like making Reubens, right? And so I'm not going to pull any punches. It was just a terrible, awful time in my life. I woke up every day with this feeling of dread and a feeling of very, very little sense of self-worth, just thinking, what the hell am I doing with myself? And the more I had this feeling of dread, the more broken I began to feel, and the further away I felt from a life of effort, risk, momentum, and joy. And it just became this terrible, vicious cycle that I didn't really know how to break out of. I didn't know how to arrive at some place. And sure, the role of one's life, or the goal of one's life, isn't to be exceptional, but at least to be useful seems like a modest goal. Certainly I can be useful somehow. And I would drive home every day in tears, just feeling incredibly broken. And one day, without really intending to, I drove down to the Intervale to go for a walk. And it was one of those early June days where Burlington is at its most seductive. Like the trees had that flush of like emerald green growth, and the birds were singing, and the air smelled like freshly tilled soil. Everyone's so happy. And I thought to myself, what is this place? Like, has this really been here all this time? I mean, I knew about the Intervale. Like, I'm from here, but I hadn't really experienced it. I hadn't had that moment of arriving and really understanding what the Intervale was. And so it became a little ritual. I would wake up, panic, make Reubens, have an existential crisis, drive home in tears, and then go for a walk at the Intervale, right? Not an ideal life, but not altogether without redemption either, right? And so it was a day I was going for a walk down there, and I was walking along the river, And there's a place that people may know along the river where the two trails converge, and there's those old car chassis just sticking up out of the floodplain, right? It's sort of like Burlington's miniature version of Cadillac Desert, right? And I was walking along the trail, and I just stopped dead in my tracks. And in that moment, I realized I knew that everything around me that I had come to value and appreciate so much had been, at one point, had been a dump, right? The Intervale was a dump, right? That's when you had a car that you didn't need, or a dishwasher, or a pet. You just brought it down there, and that's where you got rid of it, right? When something was broken and didn't have any worth, the Intervale was where you dumped it. And it's only through the collective visioning and collective effort of this community, and day after day after day of many, many people in this room deciding that this place is worth something, that we've changed it. It's become this place we call the Intervale, this place that reminds me of a concept I once heard from someone who teaches permaculture called site repair, which means that we don't just fix the earth so we can use it again. It's not a button or a zipper, right? But that we fundamentally restore the planet so that it restores us, right? That the things that we choose to fix in our lives in turn will fix us. So on its 30th birthday to the Intervale, I say happy birthday and thank you for being a place when you're feeling lost or broken or in need of just the tiniest little bit of joy can help you to find your way home. Thanks.
I want to invite all of our storytellers to come on up, and just one more huge round of applause. I also want to invite Sue Schmidt to come on up. Come on up, Sue. Sue's a moth producer and has helped us pull this event together. And so thank you, Sue, and all of our amazing storytellers. And finally, thank you all for coming out tonight. We'll have a big 30th anniversary celebration June 23rd and hope to see a lot of you there. Thanks again for coming tonight.